Letter of Transmittal, Preface and Introduction of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Spiegel. A Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Letter of Transmittal. June 27, 1974. Honorable James O. Eastland, President pro tempore, United States Senate, Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. President, under the authority of Senate Resolution 63, 93rd Congress, First Session, as amended by subsequent resolutions, I am submitting on behalf of all the members of the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities the committee's final report. As you know, the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities was established on February 7, 1973, to make a complete investigation and study of the extent to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities occurred in the 1972 presidential campaign and election, and to determine whether new legislation is needed to safeguard the electoral process by which the President of the United States is chosen. I am pleased to report that the committee has completed the vital and historic task assigned to it by the unanimous vote of the Senate. It is urgent that the Congress implement the recommendations of the Select Committee as set forth in this final report in response to the mandate of Senate Resolution 60. With warm regards, sincerely, Sam J. Ervin, Jr., Chairman. Preface. This report represents the culmination of 1.5 years' work of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Our mandate was Senate Resolution 60, adopted on February 7, 1973 by a Senate vote of 77-0, which directed the Select Committee to make one of the most comprehensive investigations in the history of Congress. Although the task given to the committee appeared in the beginning to be hardly possible to fully accomplish, I am pleased to report at the end of our work that the committee did, in fact, successfully complete the mission given to it by Senate Resolution 60. It is a matter of special satisfaction and pride to me that our committee assumed its responsibility initially in a bipartisan manner, and despite all the pressures inherent in such a highly politically charged investigation, ended its work in a bipartisan manner. This report is a unanimous report of the full committee. I wish to express my deep appreciation and gratitude for the untiring and dedicated contributions and support of all the members of the committee. Without their sacrifice, valuable advice, and wholehearted participation, our task would not have been so fully accomplished. I wish to especially express my gratitude and admiration for the remarkably splendid and professional job done by the committee's chief counsel, Sam Dash. His was the responsibility to plan and supervise the investigation, the presentation of witnesses at our hearings, and the preparation of the report. Our hearings and report are a tribute to his excellent fulfillment of this responsibility. The staff who worked under Professor Dash's supervision were exceptionally able and talented young men and women. They were given a Herculean task and proved equal to the challenge. The committee is indebted to them for their tireless and inspired efforts, involving, through most of the committee's existence, late evening hours 7 days a week. Special recognition should be given to Assistant Chief Counsel David Dorson, James Hamilton, and Terry Lenzner. The bipartisan constructive effort and cooperation of Minority Counsel Fred Thompson and his staff helped the committee to complete its work with one unanimously approved report. A select committee such as ours, created by the Senate for a special function, appears briefly on the nation's scene, does its work, and disappears. It is my firm belief that the bright light this committee has shed on the matter given it to study illuminated the American public's understanding and consciousness of the Watergate affair, and will not quickly fade. Sam J. Ervin, Jr., Chairman, Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Introduction. This report represents the findings and recommendations of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities based on its investigation of the Watergate break-in and cover-up, illegal and improper campaign practices and financing, and other wrongdoing during the presidential campaign of 1972. Once termed a cancer growing on the presidency by a principal committee witness, Watergate is one of America's most tragic happenings. This characterization of Watergate is not merely based on the fact that the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate was burglarized in the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, Rather, it is also an appraisal of the events that led to the burglary and its sordid aftermath, an aftermath characterized by corruption, fraud, and abuse of official power. The Select Committee is acutely conscious that, at the time it presents this report, the issue of impeachment of the President on Watergate-related evidence is pending in the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives. The Select Committee also recognizes that there are pending indictments against numerous defendants, most of whom were witnesses before the committee, which charge crimes that, directly or indirectly, related to its inquiry. It thus must be stressed that the committee's hearings were not conducted, and this report not prepared, to determine the legal guilt or innocence of any person or whether the President should be impeached. In this regard, it is important to note that the committee, during its short lifespan, has not obtained all the information it sought or desired, and thus certain of its findings are tentative, subject to re-evaluation when the full facts emerge. Moreover, the committee, in stating the facts as it sees them, has not applied the standard of proof applicable to a criminal proceeding, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Its conclusions, therefore, must not be interpreted as a final legal judgment that any individual has violated the criminal laws. The committee, however, to be true to its mandate from the Senate and its constitutional responsibilities, must present its view of the facts. The committee's enabling resolution, Senate Resolution 60, 93rd Congress, First Session, February 7, 1973, which was passed by a unanimous Senate, instructs the committee to make a complete investigation and study of the extent to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities occurred in the 1972 presidential campaign and election, and to determine whether new legislation is needed to safeguard the electoral process by which the President of the United States is chosen, Senate Resolution 60, Sections 1A and 2. Thus, the factual statements contained in this report perform two basic legislative tasks. First, they serve as a basis for the remedial legislation recommended herein, which the committee believes will assist in preserving the integrity of the electoral process, not only for present-day citizens but also for future generations of Americans. Second, they fulfill the historic function of the Congress to oversee the administration of executive agencies of government and to inform the public of any wrongdoing or abuses it uncovers. The critical importance of this latter function cannot be overemphasized. As the Supreme Court said in Watkins v. United States, 354 U.S. 178-200, 1957, there is a power of the Congress to inquire into and publicize corruption, maladministration, or inefficiency in agencies of the government. That was the only kind of activity described by Woodrow Wilson in Congressional Government when he wrote, "The informing function of Congress should be preferred even to its legislative function." Id. at 303. From the earliest times in its history, the Congress has assiduously performed an informing function of this nature. And in United States v. Rumley, 345 U.S. 4143, 1953, the Supreme Court termed the informing function indispensable and observed, "It is the proper duty of a representative body to look diligently into every affair of government and to talk much about what it sees. It is meant to be the eyes and the voice, and to embody the wisdom and will of its constituents. Unless Congress have and use every means of acquainting itself with the acts and the disposition of the administrative agents of the government, the country must be helpless to learn how it is being served, and unless Congress both scrutinize these things and sift them by every form of discussion, the country must remain in embarrassing, crippling ignorance of the very affairs which it is most important that it should understand and direct. The informing function of Congress should be preferred even to the legislative function." Wilson, Congressional Government, 303. It is in part to fulfill the historic informing function that the committee reveals to the public the detailed facts contained in this report. Before turning to a recitation of the facts as the committee sees them, certain general observations based on the evidence before the committee are appropriate. The Watergate affair reflects an alarming indifference displayed by some in the high public office or position of concepts of morality and public responsibility and trust. Indeed, the conduct of many Watergate participants seems grounded on the belief that the ends justified the means, that the laws could be flaunted to maintain the present administration in office. Unfortunately, the attitude that the law can be bent where expediency dictates was not confined to a few government and campaign officials. The testimony respecting the campaign funding practices of some of the nation's largest and most respectable corporations furnishes clear examples of the subjugation of legal and ethical standards to pragmatic considerations. Hopefully, after the flood of Watergate revelations the country has witnessed, the public can now expect, at least for some years to come, a higher standard of conduct from its public officials and its business and professional leaders. Also, it is hoped that the Watergate exposures have created what former Vice President Agnew has called a post-Watergate morality, where respect for law and morality is paramount. In approaching its task of recommending remedial legislation, the committee is mindful that revelations of past scandals have often failed to produce meaningful reform. Too frequently there is a tendency to overreact in the wake of a particular scandal and burden the penal code with ill-considered laws directed to the specific, perhaps aberrational, conduct exposed. This proliferation of criminal laws has tended to overcomplicate the penal code and, consequently, to impair the effectiveness of its administration. Moreover, legislation is, at best, a blunt weapon to combat immorality. While this report does make certain specific recommendations for new criminal legislation or for strengthening existing criminal laws, the committee has been careful to recommend only where the need is clear. Its major legislative recommendations relate to the creation of new institutions necessary to safeguard the electoral process, to provide the requisite checks against the abuse of executive power, and to ensure the prompt and just enforcement of laws that already exist. Surely one of the most penetrating lessons of Watergate is that campaign practices must be effectively supervised and enforcement of the criminal laws vigorously pursued against all offenders, even those of high estate, if our free institutions are to survive. The committee's mandate was broad and its time to meet it brief. Nonetheless, the committee believes that, through its efforts and those of others, the basic facts of the Watergate scandal have been exposed to public view and, as a result, the American people have been reawakened to the task democracy imposes upon them, steadfast vigilance of the conduct of the public officials they choose to lead them. This public awareness, in turn, has provided the atmosphere necessary to support other essential governmental responses to Watergate, such as the work of the special prosecutor and the activities of the House Judiciary Committee on impeachment. Because the nation is now alert, because the processes of justice are now functioning, and because the time is right for passage of new laws to safeguard the electoral process, the committee is hopeful that, despite the excesses of Watergate, the nation will return to its democratic ideals established almost 200 years ago. 1. The committee and its staff. As noted, the U.S. Senate created the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities on February 7, 1973, by unanimous adoption of Senate Resolution 60. The 7 committee members appointed by the Senate leadership to answer the mandate of Senate Resolution 60 were Sam J. Ervin, Jr., Democrat, North Carolina, Chairman; Howard H. Baker, Jr., Republican, Tennessee, Vice Chairman; Herman E. Talmadge, Democrat, Georgia; Daniel K. Inouye, Democrat, Hawaii; Joseph M. Montoya, Democrat, New Mexico; Edward J. Gurney, Republican, Florida; and Lowell P. Weicker, Jr., Republican, Connecticut. Like the Select Committee formed to investigate the Teapot Dome scandals nearly half a century ago, the Senate Watergate Committee, as it was quickly renamed by the news media, was born in the crisis of a serious loss of confidence by the public in its national government. At the time the committee was established, the trial of the Watergate burglars had been recently completed with the conviction of the 7 defendants, all but 2 of whom had pleaded guilty. The trial was prosecuted on the theory that G. Gordon Liddy, former FBI agent and counsel for the Finance Committee to re-elect the president, had masterminded the break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and that no higher campaign or White House officials were involved. Chief Judge John Sirica, the presiding judge, never accepted this theory. His repeated questions to witnesses and the prosecution staff indicated his disbelief that criminal involvement stopped at Liddy. Courageous investigative reporters raised similar doubts in news stories and columns. The smell of cover-up was in the air. Senate Resolution 60, passed after the Watergate trial concluded, evinces the Senate's belief that the Department of Justice could not be trusted fully to investigate and uncover the true story of Watergate, but no substantial indication of the magnitude of the Watergate affair had yet emerged. The Senate Select Committee was given the broadest mandate to investigate completely not only the break-in of the DNC headquarters and any subsequent cover-up, but also all other illegal, improper, or unethical conduct occurring during the presidential campaign of 1972, including political espionage and campaign financing practices. All the investigative powers at the Senate's disposal were given the committee. Thus, the committee had the power of subpoena, the power to grant limited or use immunity to witnesses to obtain their testimony, and the power to enforce the committee's subpoenas by initiating contempt procedures. On February 21, 1973, at its first organizational meeting, the committee, on the recommendation of Chairman Irvin, unanimously appointed Professor Samuel Dash as Chief Counsel and Staff Director for the committee. Professor Dash had formerly been District Attorney in Philadelphia, an active trial lawyer, and Chairman of the Section of Criminal Law of the American Bar Association. At the time of his appointment, Mr. Dash was Professor of Law and Director of the Institute of Criminal Law and Procedure of Georgetown University Law Center. Shortly afterwards, Vice Chairman Baker, acting under the provisions of Senate Resolution 60, appointed as Minority Counsel Mr. Fred Thompson, a trial lawyer and former Assistant U.S. Attorney in Nashville, Tennessee. During the month of March, the Chief Counsel selected as Deputy Chief Counsel Mr. Rufus Edmonston, who also served as Chief Counsel of the Senate Subcommittee on Separation of Powers, and his Assistant Chief Counsel for the three areas of the investigation: Watergate break-in and cover-up, campaign practices, and campaign financing. David M. Dorson was assigned supervision of the campaign financing phase, including investigation of the Milk Fund affairs. Mr. Dorson was especially aided in the Milk Fund investigation by Assistant Counsel Alan S. Weitz. Mr. Terry Letzner took charge of the campaign practices phase and also headed the investigation into the Hughes-Rebozo matter. Serving as Mr. Letzner's principal aides in these investigations were Assistant Counsel Mark Lackritz and investigator Scott Armstrong. Mr. James Hamilton was assigned responsibility for the Watergate break-in and cover-up phase. Because of the rapid change in events, Messrs. Dorson and Letzner also spent considerable time on this phase. Mr. Hamilton, with the aid of Assistant Counsel Ronald D. Rotunda, Special Counsel Richard B. Stewart, and a number of expert consultants, was also responsible for most of the committee's litigation efforts, including the preparation of the pleadings and briefs in its suit against the President, and, with Mr. Dorson, supervised the investigation into the so-called responsiveness program. Both Mr. Dorson and Mr. Letzner had been Assistant U.S. Attorneys in the Southern District of New York, and Mr. Hamilton was trial attorney with the Washington firm of Covington and Burling. Mr. Carmine Bellino, former FBI agent and a veteran of numerous important congressional investigations, was appointed chief investigator. Professor Arthur Miller of George Washington Law School was named chief consultant to the staff. Minority Counsel Fred Thompson, appointed as his chief assistant and investigator Donald Sanders, a former FBI agent and chief counsel and staff director to the House Internal Security Committee. Appointment of other lawyers, investigators, secretarial personnel, and research assistants followed over the next several months, bringing the staff to a peak strength of approximately 90 persons by August of 1973. 2. Investigative procedures. On March 21, 1973, while the committee staff was still in its formative stages, James McCord, one of the convicted Watergate defendants, began the unraveling of the Watergate story by transmitting a sealed letter to Judge Sirica. On the morning of March 23, which had been set by Judge Sirica for the sentencing of the Watergate defendants, Judge Sirica in open court unsealed the letter and read aloud McCord's first accusations of perjury at the January 23 Watergate trial and cover-up. At 1 p.m. the same day, Mr. McCord, through his attorney, called the Select Committee's chief counsel and offered to give information to the committee. The chief counsel met with Mr. McCord and his counsel that afternoon and the following day, and Mr. McCord testified before an executive session of the full committee early the following week. McCord's revelations to the committee were the first indication that former Attorney General John Mitchell, counsel to the President John W. Dean III, and Deputy Director of the Committee for the Re-election of the President Jeb Stuart Magruder, had participated in planning and discussion with G. Gordon Liddy respecting a large-scale covert intelligence operation that ultimately resulted in the Watergate break-in. Although McCord had been a participant in the break-in, he had obtained information about the planning meetings and the later payments of hush money to purchase silence through discussions with Liddy and others. Thus, the involvement of higher officials in Watergate activities could not be proved through McCord's testimony, since it was largely hearsay. Although a Senate investigating committee may receive hearsay testimony, the Select Committee decided, because of its desire to limit unfounded rumor and speculation, to employ a higher standard of proof for the establishment of crucial facts. It was thus decided that McCord's testimony would not be presented in public session until it could be corroborated by other evidence. Accordingly, the staff began an intensive investigation. Secretaries to key officials at CRP, the White House, and the Department of Justice, as well as other staff personnel, were questioned and their records subpoenaed and examined. Gradually, corroboration for McCord's story emerged. A secretary's diary was uncovered, which showed meetings in Mr. Mitchell's Justice Department office on January 27th and February 4th, 1972, attended by Messrs. Mitchell, Dean, Magruder, and Liddy. A CRP staff member remembered Liddy's agitated search for an easel in the CRP offices on the morning of January 27th. McCord had told the committee that, according to Liddy, Liddy had that day made a show-and-tell presentation respecting his intelligence plan in the Attorney General's office using large cards on an easel. A secretary recalled seeing Liddy with several large white cards wrapped in brown paper in the CRP offices prior to the January 27th meeting. The former FCRP treasurer, Hugh Sloan, informed the committee of Magruder's effort to suborn his perjury before the grand jury. Sloan also gave evidence as to the large amounts of cash paid to Liddy with Mr. Mitchell's approval for purposes concerning which Sloan said FCRP head Maurice Stens told him, "I do not want to know and you don't want to know." As hundreds of details were collected, it became clear that the committee could corroborate with circumstantial evidence much of McCord's hearsay testimony. More importantly, in April certain of the principals involved, Mr. Magruder and Mr. Dean, signified their willingness to testify before the committee. A. Use of immunity powers. It was then that the use of immunity powers granted the committee became important. Magruder and Dean were being questioned by the U.S. attorneys in preparation for their grand jury testimony. They were targets for indictment and could not be expected to cooperate with the committee without a grant of use immunity. The committee voted immunity for these witnesses and others, and thus secured the direct testimony of persons who had participated in criminal acts. The staff, most of whom had been employed in April, had uncovered by the middle of May much of the evidence it was to present during the Watergate phase of the hearings, a result obtained by around-the-clock efforts. Also, the members of the committee held frequent executive committee meetings to receive staff progress reports, legal opinions, and to vote use of subpoena and immunity powers to assist the staff in obtaining the facts. In exercising its immunity power, the committee weighed carefully the determinative question whether the testimony to be gained was vital to the committee's investigation or would reveal the significant involvement of persons of greater rank. The committee did not seek an immunity order for any witnesses who could not meet these tests and would only provide information as to his own involvement in the Watergate affair. In April, the committee announced that public hearings would begin May 17, 1973, on the Watergate and cover-up phase of the investigation. While this provided only short lead time, the committee was deeply conscious of public concern about the true parameters of the Watergate matter. It thus believed public hearings should start as promptly as possible. The committee opened its hearings on May 17, 1973, and maintained its hearing schedule, which increased from 3 to 5 days a week without interruption, except for 2 brief recesses, until August 7, 1973. 37 witnesses testified during this period. Hundreds of exhibits and documents were introduced into the record, and over 3,000 pages of testimony were transcribed. The committee's hearings on the Watergate break-in and cover-up phase constituted the longest uninterrupted congressional hearings in the history of the Congress. B. Satellite charts on key witnesses. While many techniques to gain evidence were used, one investigative strategy in particular was responsible for some of the staff's most significant results, including the discovery of the White House taping system. In regard to each major witness, the chief counsel assigned a team of lawyers and investigators to collect as much evidence as possible respecting this witness from secondary sources. To accomplish this most efficiently, each team prepared what the staff came to call a satellite chart for every major witness. Plotted on the chart would be the name and position of every person who had a significant contact with the witness during the relevant time periods, and who had been in a position to receive pertinent information and records. One principal witness alone had 60 satellites on his chart. Each satellite witness was interviewed by the staff and his or her records subpoenaed and examined. The now famous ITT memorandum from Charles Colson to H.R. Haldeman was obtained from a satellite on Mr. Colson's chart, and Mr. Butterfield, who revealed the White House taping system, was interviewed simply because he was a satellite on Mr. Haldeman's chart. After John Dean informed the committee that he suspected that the President had taped a conversation between them in the Oval Office on April 15, 1973, some potentially knowledgeable witnesses were asked whether the President did, in fact, tape conversations. When Deputy Minority Counsel Donald Sanders asked Mr. Butterfield whether he knew of any facts supporting Dean's intimation that conversations in the President's office were tape-recorded, Butterfield responded by informing the committee of the White House taping system. Then, in response to an earlier question by investigator Scott Armstrong, Butterfield stated that the reconstruction of the President's conversations with John Dean, which had been given the committee by special counsel to the President J. Fred Bushartz, must have been prepared by use of the tapes of those meetings. C. Computer operations. Another important investigative tool was the computer of the Library of Congress, whose capabilities were offered the committee shortly after its formation. The committee accepted this offer and developed a computer staff to utilize this facility. To the committee's knowledge, this was the first time a congressional investigating committee employed a computer for the storage of information for investigative and analytical purposes. Almost all of the committee's investigative files and records were stored on computer tapes, including documentary records, witness interviews, executive sessions, public sessions, depositions in related civil cases, the transcript of the first Watergate trial, and certain newspaper clippings for the period from June 17, 1972 through the investigative phase. Computer printouts on individual witnesses permitted the staff to retrieve all available information respecting a given witness. Thus, discrepancies in testimony could easily be spotted and relevant documents identified for use in examination. The computer also proved a valuable tool for preparation of the committee's final report. On the basis of its experience, the committee recommends the use of computer technology in future congressional investigations. It also notes that the computer staff has provided the special prosecutor and the House Judiciary Committee with a complete duplicate of its computer tape, and that committee's impeachment inquiry thus had at its disposal the Select Committee's complete computer input. D. Other investigative procedures. The committee employed a variety of procedures for obtaining facts. Witnesses were usually interviewed informally and not under oath. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed either in the committee offices, in the new Senate office building, or at various places throughout the country. In cases where the witness was testifying under a grant of immunity, or it was otherwise important to have his or her testimony under oath, the witness was examined in executive session. Oaths for executive sessions were administered by a member of the committee and verbatim transcripts of testimony prepared. Thousands of documents, records, and other tangible evidentiary materials were subpoenaed by the committee, examined by the staff and the committee, and stored in secure files. The committee's investigation was aided by the fact that the staffs of the White House and CRP frequently recorded their activities in documentary form. It appeared to be the practice of the officials involved to circulate duplicate copies of various memoranda throughout the White House and CRP, and the files of CRP were filled with duplicate copies of memoranda written by top White House officials. After the 1972 election, CRP delivered its files to the National Archives. When the Select Committee learned that this had occurred, a subpoena for these files was issued, and, over a period of months, staff investigators examined a vast collection of documents stored at the archives. A great number of confidential, eyes-only memoranda thus became available for the committee's inspection. A significant number of the memoranda revealed during the public hearings and/or embodied in this final report came from this source. 3. The public hearings. The character of the committee's hearings resulted from considerable planning and a basic philosophy. The committee, aware of the gravity of the national scandal it was investigating and the fact that its activities would be highly publicized, was determined to present dignified, objective hearings. It recognized that the ultimate impact of its work depended upon obtaining and keeping public confidence. In part for these reasons, the committee resisted calling certain so-called big-name witnesses at the beginning of its hearings. The committee and its staff wished to present a careful presentation of the evidence, establishing a foundation for the later testimony that implicated high government and campaign officials. Early witnesses of lesser stature that enabled the public to understand the context in which the Watergate affair unfolded were essential. The chief counsel and staff recommended this building block approach to the committee, and the committee unanimously adopted it. The committee followed a practice not typical of certain congressional hearings. It refrained from calling a witness in public session that it knew would refuse to testify on the assertion of the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. When a witness in executive session claimed this constitutional right and declined to answer the committee's queries, the matter ended and the witness was not required to assert his privilege in public session. This policy was instituted upon the recommendation of the chief counsel, with which the committee agreed, on the belief that no legislative purpose would be served by public exhibitions of witnesses who claimed their privilege. The committee believed it was important that its public hearings be televised. Live television coverage occurred during the first phase of the committee's hearings, covering the Watergate break-in and the cover-up. Public television carried, through its evening gavel-to-gavel coverage, most of the committee's public hearings. The committee's interest in televised hearings was not to obtain publicity for publicity's sake. The facts which the committee produced dealt with the very integrity of the electoral process. They were facts, the committee believed, the public had a right to know. Most citizens were not able personally to attend the working sessions of their government. Although thousands of people spent short periods in the caucus room during the hearings, these visitors represented only a small percentage of the electorate. Thus, it was desirable that every citizen be able to view the hearings, if not in the caucus room, then in his home or place of business. The ability to read about the hearings in the printed media was not sufficient. The full import of the hearings could only be achieved by observing the witnesses and hearing their testimony. It was for this reason that the committee opposed the efforts in federal court of Special Prosecutor Cox to prescribe television and radio coverage of the testimony of Magruder and Dean. The special prosecutor's expressed concern was that public hearings might prejudice future criminal trials. It was the committee's position that they would not, but, even if they did, it was more important in this period of crisis and national concern that the full facts be promptly made known. The public should not have to wait a year or more until the Watergate trials were over to know the scope of the corruption in its government. The court supported the committee's position and refused to interfere with the committee's public hearings. The committee believes that its position has proven correct, and that its public hearings awakened the public to the perils posed by the Watergate affair, to the integrity of the electoral process and our democratic form of government. Perhaps proof of the impact of the committee's hearings is found in the unprecedented public response to the firing of Special Prosecutor Cox on October 20, 1973. On that weekend alone, 500,000 telegrams came to the Congress. Hundreds of thousands of telegrams flowed in during the following days. The overwhelming sentiment of these telegrams was in opposition to the President's action. It is doubtful that public sentiment would have been so aroused by the President's action had the public not been sensitized to the issues involved through the committee's hearings. The committee wishes to note, before it proceeds to present its findings, that it has received no evidence suggesting any complicity in wrongdoing on the part of the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee or their principal officers during the presidential campaign of 1972. End of introduction.
Section 1 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Chapter 1, The Watergate Break-In and Its Prelude, Part 1. The Watergate drama is still unfolding because all the facts are not yet in, because all the Watergate criminal trials and the impeachment proceeding are not concluded, and because the President has refused to produce to the Select Committee many crucial tape recordings and other evidence. This report, although it is the committee's final report, is incomplete. And this report is limited in another way. Because of the massive amount of evidence now available as to Watergate, developed in the committee's hearings and elsewhere, it is impossible in a document of reasonable length to deal with every fact or every version of the facts. The committee, therefore, in preparing this report, has exercised its judgment as to what facts are important and which versions of disputed facts should be included. Others may disagree with our account, but it is the committee's mandate under Senate Resolution No. 60 to present the Watergate affair to the public as it sees it. 1. The Watergate Break-In and Its Prelude. In the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, James McCord, Bernard L. Barker, Frank Sturgis, Eugenio Martinez, and Virgilio Gonzalez illegally entered the Democratic National Committee headquarters on the 6th floor of the Watergate office building. Nearby, in a room in the Watergate Hotel, Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, the supervisors of this burglary operation, stood by keeping in walkie-talkie communication with Alfred Baldwin, who served as a lookout across the street from the Watergate complex in the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge. The mission was ill-fated. Within a short time after the break-in, a Washington Metropolitan Police Department plainclothes unit in an unmarked car responded to a call to assist a guard at the Watergate office building. The guard, Frank Willis, had become suspicious when, for the second time that night, he found masking tape on the edge of a door in the garage leading to the office building. The tape had been placed to hold back the locking mechanism, permitting the door to be opened without a key. Earlier that night, Wills had removed tape from the same door, thinking it had been inadvertently left by a building engineer. The plainclothes unit, under the direction of Sergeant Paul Leeper, entered the Watergate office building stairwell through the garage door and ascended to the 8th floor. The policemen worked their way down to the 6th floor level and entered that floor through the stairwell door, which they found unlocked by the same masking tape technique employed on the garage door. Alfred Baldwin, across the street at the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge, at first took no interest in the unmarked car which parked in front of the Watergate office building and in the casually dressed individuals who entered the building. That a plainclothes police squad in an unmarked car that answered the police dispatcher's call was fortuitous. The call initially went out to a marked police car, but that vehicle was on its way to a gasoline station. The dispatcher thus repeated the call for any tactical unit in the vicinity of the Watergate. Had the marked police car answered the call and had uniformed policemen entered the office building, Baldwin would have immediately taken notice and alerted the burglars who might have escaped. The true nature of the break-in might not have been discovered, and there might have been no need for the massive cover-up that followed, which when exposed became the most serious political scandal in the nation's history. Baldwin did not become alarmed until he noticed lights go on in the building, first on the 8th floor, then on the 6th, and saw two casually dressed individuals emerge on the 6th floor terrace of the D&C headquarters, one holding a pistol. Then he radioed Hunt and Liddy and asked, "Are our people in suits or are they dressed casually?" When the answer came back, "Our people are dressed in suits. Why?" Baldwin replied, "You have some trouble because there are some individuals around here who are dressed casually and have got their guns out." Within minutes, Sergeant Leeper and his unit discovered the 5 burglars and arrested them. Hunt and Liddy, however, escaped unnoticed from the Watergate Hotel. Baldwin was told by Hunt to leave the Motor Lodge, which he promptly did. Subsequently, Hunt and Liddy were indicted with the 5 men apprehended at the D&C headquarters. United States versus Liddy et al. Indictment of September 15, 1972. And Baldwin became a principal government witness against his former co-conspirators. All defendants initially pleaded not guilty, but as the trial opened in early January 1973, Hunt, Barker, Sturgis, Martinez, and Gonzalez changed their pleas to guilty. The remaining defendants, McCord and Liddy, were found guilty after a trial that left a number of questions which disturbed the trial judge, Congress, and the American people. The crimes of wiretapping, burglary, and conspiracy had been proved. But why had these crimes been committed? Who sponsored them? What were the motivations? Was the break-in, as the White House immediately claimed, merely a third-rate burglary? This report attempts to put this crime in focus. We discuss below the background and planning that led to the break-in, as well as other activities by the burglary team now uncovered. We then deal with the extensive cover-up that followed the apprehension of the burglars. A. The background of Watergate. The Watergate break-in cannot be understood unless viewed in the context of similar White House activities. The evidence presented below shows that, from the early days of the present administration, the power of the president was viewed by some in the White House as almost without limit, especially when national and internal security was invoked. Even criminal laws were considered subordinate to presidential decision or strategy. The manifestations of this philosophy that preceded the Watergate break-in are now discussed. 1. The Houston Plan. The earliest evidence of this concept of presidential power existed is found in the 1970 top-secret document entitled Operational Restraints on Intelligence Collection, and the various memorandums from Tom Charles Houston to H.R. Haldeman, which were first revealed by John Dean. In preparation for his testimony before the Select Committee, Dean placed these papers, some of which bore the highest security classification, in the custody of Chief Judge John Sirica of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. This step was taken by Dean on the advice of counsel to avoid violation of any presidential directive of federal laws prohibiting release of government documents affecting national security. After due consideration, Judge Sirica released one copy of these papers to the Department of Justice and one copy to the Select Committee pursuant to its motions. United States v. John Doe et al. Miscellaneous No. 77-73, May 14, 1973. The committee, with the aid of various intelligence agencies, reviewed these documents. While the committee sealed a few items therein which could involve national security considerations, it concluded that these papers, for the most part, dealt primarily with domestic affairs and were unrelated to national security matters. The papers, as sanitized by the committee, were entered into the committee's record during Dean's testimony. These papers and the President's own statement of May 22, 1973, disclosed that the President approved the use of illegal wiretapping, illegal break-ins, and illegal mail covers for domestic intelligence purposes. The President was fully advised of the illegality of these intelligence gathering techniques prior to approving them. In the top-secret document entitled Operational Restraints on Intelligence Collection, the recommendation for surreptitious entries, or break-ins, contained the following statement under the heading Rationale. Use of this technique is clearly illegal. It amounts to burglary. It is also highly risky and could result in great embarrassment if exposed. However, it is also the most fruitful tool and can produce the type of intelligence which cannot be obtained in any other fashion. On July 14, 1970, Haldeman sent a top-secret memorandum to Houston, notifying him of the President's approval of the use of burglaries, illegal wiretaps, and illegal mail covers for domestic intelligence. In the memorandum, Haldeman stated, "The recommendations you have proposed as a result of the review have been approved by the President. He does not, however, want to follow the procedure you outlined on page 4 of your memorandum regarding implementation. He would prefer that the thing simply be put into motion on the basis of this approval. The formal official memorandum should, of course, be prepared, and that should be the device by which to carry it out." It also appears that the next day, July 15, 1970, Houston prepared a decision memorandum based on the President's approval for distribution to the federal intelligence agencies involved in the plan, the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. In his May 22, 1973 public statement, the President reported that the decision memorandum was circulated to the agencies involved on July 23, 1970. However, the decision memorandum is dated July 15, 1970, indicating that it was forwarded to the agencies on that day or shortly thereafter. Houston's recommendations were opposed by J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. Hoover had served as the chairman of a group comprised of the heads of the federal intelligence agencies formed to study the problems of intelligence gathering and cooperation among the various intelligence agencies. In his public statement of May 22, 1973, President Nixon stated, "After reconsideration, however, prompted by the opposition of Director Hoover, the agencies were notified 5 days later, on July 28, that the approval had been rescinded." Haldeman's testimony is to the same effect. Dean, however, testified that he was not aware of any rescission of approval for the plan, and there apparently is no written record of a rescission on July 28 or any other date. There is, however, clear evidence that, after receipt of the decision memorandum of July 15, 1970, Mr. Hoover did present strong objections concerning the plan to Attorney General Mitchell. Houston was concerned that Hoover's objections would interfere with the plan's implementation. On August 5, 1970, 8 days after the President states he ordered rescission, Houston sent Haldeman a lengthy top-secret memorandum on the subject, domestic intelligence, which strongly attacked Hoover's objections and made a number of recommendations concerning a forthcoming meeting regarding the plan among Haldeman, the Attorney General, and Hoover. Indicative of the fact that the plan was still quite alive, but imperiled by Hoover, is the following language in this memorandum. At some point, Hoover has to be told who is president. He has become totally unreasonable, and his conduct is detrimental to our domestic intelligence operations. It is important to remember that the entire intelligence community knows that the president made a positive decision to go ahead, and Hoover has now succeeded in forcing a review. If he gets his way, it is going to look like he is more powerful than the president. He had his say in the footnotes, and RN decided against him. That should close the matter, and I can't understand why the AG is a party in reopening it. All of us are going to look damn silly in the eyes of Helms, Gaylor, Bennett, and the military chiefs if Hoover can unilaterally reverse a presidential decision based on a report that many people worked their asses off to prepare and which, on the merits, was a first-rate, objective job. It should be noted that this memorandum indicates that the NSA, DIA, CIA, and the military services basically supported the Houston recommendations. 2 days later, on August 7, 1970, Houston sent a brief, confidential memorandum to Haldeman, urging that Haldeman meet with the Attorney General and secure his support of the president's decision, that the director, that is Hoover, be informed that the decision will stand, and that all intelligence agencies are to proceed to implement them at once. Houston noted that Mr. Hoover has departed for the West Coast to vacation for 3 weeks. If you wait until his return to clear up the problems surrounding our domestic intelligence operations, we will be into the new school year without any preparations. Later, on September 18, 1970, almost 2 months after the president claims the plan was rescinded, Dean sent a top-secret memorandum to the Attorney General suggesting certain procedures to commence our domestic intelligence operation as quickly as possible. This memorandum specifically called for the creation of an interagency domestic intelligence unit, which had been an integral part of the Houston plan. Dean's memorandum to the Attorney General observed that Hoover was strongly opposed to the creation of such a unit, and that it was important to bring the FBI fully on board. Far from indicating that the president's approval of Houston's recommendation to remove restraints on illegal intelligence gathering had been withdrawn, Dean, in his memorandum, suggested to the Attorney General, "I believe we agreed that it would be inappropriate to have any blanket removal of restrictions. Rather, the most appropriate procedure would be to decide on the type of intelligence we need, based on an assessment of the recommendations of this unit, and then proceed to remove the restraints as necessary to obtain such intelligence." Dean's memorandum indicated that the creation of the Interagency Domestic Intelligence Unit would go forward and provide recommendations for the choosing of a unit director to serve as a right-hand man to the Attorney General, and for the selection of representatives from the various intelligence agencies who would serve on it. Dean closed his memorandum with the suggestion that the Attorney General call weekly meetings to monitor problems as they emerged, and to make certain that we are moving this program into implementation as quickly as possible. Recognizing that Hoover was still a problem, Dean added a note to the bottom of his memorandum. "Bob Haldeman has suggested to me that if you would like him to join you in a meeting with Hoover, he will be happy to do so." Hoover, however, never did come completely on board, and the plan for an interagency domestic intelligence unit was never implemented. A clue to the fate of the Houston plan is provided by the edited, unauthenticated submission of recorded presidential conversations to the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives by President Richard Nixon on April 30, 1974, where the following passage appears. D. What Bill Sullivan's desire in life is to set up a domestic national security intelligence system, a White House program. He says we are deficient. He says we have never been efficient because Hoover lost his guts several years ago. If you recall, he and Tom Houston worked on it. Tom Houston had your instructions to go out and do it, and the whole thing just crumbled. P. Inaudible. Dean testified that the plan for the creation of an interagency domestic intelligence unit was the product of White House fear of demonstrations and dissent. Haldeman denied that such an atmosphere of fear existed in the White House. In his statement before the committee, Haldeman gave as the reason for White House interest in improving intelligence gathering operations the critical proportions of the domestic security problem in 1970 as illustrated by a wave of bombings and explosions, rioting and violence, demonstrations, arson, gun battles, and other disruptive activities across the country, on college campuses primarily, but also in other areas. On this issue, Ehrlichman's testimony corroborates Haldeman's. The Houston recommendations themselves refer to a major threat to the internal security and express the belief that the potential for even greater violence is present, and we have a positive obligation to take every step within our power to prevent it, for surely drastic violence and disorder threaten the very fabric of our society. The committee notes that the evidence presented to Senator McClellan's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Senate Committee on Government Operations in hearings beginning in July 1970 indicates that, in the several years preceding the hearings, there were significant increases in illegal acts of violence directed against government facilities and a disturbing number of such acts directed against law enforcement officials. Dean testified, however, that the White House concern was directed not only toward violent demonstrations, but also to peaceful demonstrations and dissent. As an illustration, he said, during the late winter of 1971, the president happened to look out of the windows of the residence of the White House and saw a lone man with a large 10-foot sign stretched out in front of Lafayette Park. Mr. Higbee called me to his office to tell me of the president's displeasure with the sign in the park and told me that Mr. Haldeman said the sign had to come down. When I came out of Mr. Higbee's office, I ran into Mr. Dwight Chapin, who said he was going to get some thugs to remove that man from Lafayette Park. He said it would take him a few hours to get them, but they could do the job. 2. The enemy's list. The White House's apparent concern over dissent and opposition is reflected in an organized effort to compile a constantly updated list of the administration's enemies. The basic rationale for maintenance of the enemies list is specified in an August 16, 1971 memorandum prepared by Dean for Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and others. It reads in relevant part, dealing with our political enemies. This memorandum addresses the matter of how we can maximize the fact of our incumbency in dealing with persons known to be active in their opposition to our administration. Stated a bit more bluntly, how can we use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies? In brief, the system would work as follows. Key members of the staff, for example, Coulson, Dent, Flanagan, Buchanan, should be requested to inform us as to who they feel we should be giving a hard time. The project coordinator should then determine what sorts of dealings these individuals have with the federal government and how we can best screw them. For example, grant availability, federal contracts, litigation, prosecution, etc. The project coordinator then should have access to and the full support of the top officials of the agency or department in proceeding to deal with the individuals. As a next step, I would recommend that we develop a small list of names, not more than 10, as our targets for concentration. Request that Lynn Nofsinger do a job on them, and if he finds he is getting cut off by a department or agency, that he inform us and we evaluate what is necessary to proceed. Dean's advice to limit the list to not more than 10 was not followed. Even before this memorandum, George T. Bell circulated to Dean, Jerry Warren, and Van Shumway a sizable list of opponents that would be useful from time to time. The list contains such comments next to various names as A scandal would be most helpful here. Positive results would stick a pin in Jackson's white hat. Has known weakness for white females. A real media enemy. On September 9, 1971, Colson sent the same list to Dean, with blue check marks next to the enemies who were top priority. Colson concluded, "I think you will find this a pretty good list. Right on." Other exhibits indicate that the list was constantly updated and expanded to include businessmen, actors and actresses, labor leaders, reporters, senators and representatives, civil rights leaders, McGovern aides, leaders of peace organizations, general anti-Nixon people, Democratic contributors, and others. Dean testified that the plan to penalize administration enemies was considered important to Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and others. Strachan testified that he believed that the enemies list was in existence when I arrived at the White House in August 1970. The list was maintained by Colson's office. White House efforts to use the federal bureaucracy to punish its supposed enemies are further reflected in Committee Exhibits 44 and 65. Exhibit 44 is a memorandum and briefing paper prepared for Haldeman for a meeting with the head of the Internal Revenue Service, which came from John Dean's White House file, entitled Opponents List and Enemies Project. The memorandum is undated and not marked other than its heading. To accomplish, make IRS politically responsive. Attached to this memorandum is an IRS talking paper that concludes with the following. Johnny Walters of the IRS must be made to known that discrete political actions and investigations on behalf of the administration is a firm requirement and responsibility on his part. We should have direct access to Walters for action in sensitive areas and should not have to clear them with Treasury. Dean should have access and assurance that Walters will get the job done properly. Dean recalled that, after an article was published in Newsday on Charles B.B. Rebozo, one of the president's closest friends, Dean was told that the authors of that article should have some problems. Dean discussed this with John Caulfield, who had friends in the IRS. Dean was reluctant to discuss it with Walters. Dean recalls that the IRS did audit the newsmen involved. It appears other enemies were also subjected to IRS investigation and audit. During the September 15, 1972 meeting with the president, Dean reported on IRS investigation of Larry O'Brien, according to information Fred Buzzhart, special counsel to the president, provided to Minority Counsel. In a memorandum of June 12, 1972, to Dean, Colson wrote that there should be an IRS audit of a union official who, you should know, is an all-out enemy, a McGovernite, ardently anti-Nixon. Please let me know if this one can be started on at once, and if there is an informer's fee, let me know. There is a good cause at which it can be donated. In Dean's meeting with the president on September 15, 1972, the president, Dean, and Haldeman discussed retaliation against administration enemies, according to a purported transcript of this meeting prepared by the House Judiciary Committee, published in the Washington Post on May 17, 1974, at pages A 26-28. This transcript indicates the president may have known of the enemies list. Haldeman, at the beginning of this meeting, referred to the fact that Colson had gone through, has worked on the list, and Dean's working the thing through IRS and, in some cases, I think. The president allegedly replied, yeah. Other relevant excerpts from this September 15th meeting, based on the Judiciary Committee's purported transcript, appear below, with emphasis added. H. Unintelligible words. John, that is Dean. He is one of the quiet guys that gets a lot done. That was a good move too. Bring Dean in. But it's P. Yeah. H. He'll never gain any ground for us. He's just not that kind of guy. But he's the kind that enables other people to gain ground while he's making sure that you don't fall through the holes. P. Oh, you mean... H. Between times, he's moving ruthlessly on the investigation of McGovern people, Kennedy stuff, and all that too. I just don't know how much progress he's making, 'cause P. The problem is, that's kind of hard to find. H. Chuck has gone through, has worked on the list, and Dean's working the thing through IRS and, in some cases, I think, some other things. He turned out to be tougher than I thought he would, which is what P. Yeah. P. Well, just remember all the trouble they made us on this. We'll have a chance to get back at them one day. How are you doing on your other investigations? How does this D. I'm just about the end of the H. What's happened on the bug? P. Hard to find. On the what? H. The bug. P. Perhaps the Bureau ought to go over. H. The Bureau ought to go into Edward Bennett Williams and let's start questioning that son of a bitch. Keep him tied up for a couple of weeks. P. Yeah, I hope they do. The Bureau better get over pretty quick and get that red box. We want it cleared up. D. That's exactly the way I gave it to Gray. D. On this case, there is some bitterness between, for example, the Finance Committee and the Political Committee. They feel that they are taking all the heat and all the people upstairs are bad people and they're not being recognized. P. Ridiculous. D. It is, P. They're all in it together. D. That's right. P. They should just behave and recognize this. This is war. We're getting a few shots and it'll be over. And we'll give them a few shots and it'll be over. Don't worry. And I wouldn't want to be on the other side right now. Would you? I wouldn't want to be in Edward Bennett Williams' position after this election. D. No. P. None of these bastards. D. He's done some rather unethical things that have come to light already, which Richie has brought to our attention. P. Yeah? D. He went down. H. Keep a log on that. D. Oh, we are indeed. We are. P. Yeah. H. Because afterwards that is a guy. P. We're going to. H. That is a guy we've got to ruin. D. He had an ex parte. P. You want to remember too, he's an attorney for the Washington Post. D. I'm well aware of that. P. I think we are going to fix that son of a bitch. Believe me, we are going to. We've got to because he's a bad man. D. Absolutely. P. He misbehaved very badly in the Hoffa matter. Some pretty bad conduct there too, but go ahead. D. Well, that's along the line, one of the things I've tried to do is just keep notes on a lot of the people who are emerging as P. That's right. D. As less than our friends. P. Great. D. Because this is going to be over someday and we shouldn't forget the way some of them have treated us. P. I want the most comprehensive notes on all those who tried to do us in, because they didn't have to do it. D. That's right. P. They didn't have to do it. If the thing had been they had a very close election, everybody on the other side would understand this game. But now they are doing this quite deliberately, and they are asking for it, and they are going to get it. And we have not used the power in this first 4 years, as you know. D. That's right. P. We have never used it. We have never used the Bureau and we haven't used the Justice Department, but things are going to change now, and they're going to change, and they're going to get it right. D. That's an exciting prospect. P. It's got to be done. It's the only thing to do. D. Well, there has been some extensive clipping by the counsel in this case, and I've gone through some of these clippings, and it's just phenomenal. P. Yeah. D. The amount of coverage this case is getting. They may never get a fair trial, may never get a fair, they'll never get a jury that can convict them or pull it together. And the Post, as you know, has got a real large team that they've assigned to do nothing but this case. Couldn't believe they put Maury Stan's story about his libel suit, which was just playing so heavily on the networks last night and in the evening news, they put it way back on about page 8 of the Post. P. Sure. D. And didn't even cover it as in total. P. I expect that it's all right. We've unintelligible. H. The Post unintelligible. P. It's going to have its problems. H. Unintelligible. D. Unintelligible. The networks are good with Maury coming back 3 days in a row and unintelligible. P. That's right. The main thing is the Post is going to have damnable problems out of this. They have a television station. D. That's right, they do. P. Does that come up too? The point is, when does it come up? D. I don't know, but the practice of non-licensees filing on top of licensees has certainly gotten more. P. That's right. D. More active in this area. P. And it's going to be goddamn active here. D. Laughter. Silence. P. Well, the game has to be played awfully rough. I don't know. Well, now, you'll follow through with who will over there? Who, Timmons or a Ford or a unintelligible. There are a number of Republicans. End of section 1. Section 2 of the Watergate Report, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 1. Chapter 1. The Watergate Break-In and its Prelude, Part 2. 3. The Plumbers. In June 1971, the leak of the Pentagon Papers prompted the president to create a Special Investigations Unit, later known as the Plumbers, inside the White House under the direction of Egil Crow. Crow, in return, was directly supervised by John Ehrlichman. Crow was soon joined by David Young, and in July the unit, staffed up for a broader role, added G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, both known to the White House as persons with investigative experience. Liddy was a former FBI agent, Hunt a former CIA agent. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty negotiations were compromised by the leak of sensitive documents at the time this unit was being formed, July 23, 1971. This problem was included within the Plumbers' mission. 2 subsequent leaks were likewise added to the purview of the unit's activities. The India USSR leak, Ted Zolk article of August 13, 1971, and the India PAK leak, Jack Anderson article of December 16, 1971. According to Ehrlichman, it was felt that White House supervision of the leak-finding unit would stimulate the various departments and agencies to do a better job controlling leaks and the theft or exposure of national security secrets within their departments. This Special Investigations Unit planned and carried out the burglary of the office of Dr. Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Louis J. Fielding. While this burglary is also discussed elsewhere in this report, it is relevant here as reflective of the White House attitude towards illegal intelligence gathering. Moreover, the activities of the Plumbers are closely related to the Watergate break-in because both operations were under the supervision of Hunt and Liddy, and both employed as burglars certain Cuban Americans recruited by Hunt. 2 of the Hunt recruits participated in both burglaries. Also, fear of revelation of the Ellsberg break-in contributed significantly to the massive cover-up following the Watergate burglary. The committee report demonstrates that Crow and Young, as directors of the plumbers, recommended to Ehrlichman a covert operation to obtain Ellsberg's psychiatric records, which were in the custody of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Fielding. Crow pled guilty on November 30, 1973, to a federal charge based on his role in that affair. On the question whether Crow and Young were acting with the approval of Ehrlichman, the Select Committee received considerable evidence. On August 11, 1971, Young and Crow sent a memorandum to Ehrlichman, which included the following report and recommendation. We have received the CIA preliminary psychology study, copy attached at tab A, which I must say I am disappointed in and consider very superficial. We will meet tomorrow with the head psychiatrist, Mr. Bernard Malloy, to impress upon him the detail and depth that we expect. We will also make available to him some of the other information we have received from the FBI on Ellsberg. In this connection, we would recommend that a covert operation be undertaken to examine all the medical files still held by Ellsberg's psychoanalyst covering the 2-year period in which he was undergoing analysis. Beneath this recommendation were the words "approve" and "disapprove," each followed by a blank space. The handwritten letter E was placed in the blank space after the word "approve," and beneath it, also in handwriting, was the message, "If done under your assurance that it is not traceable." Ehrlichman testified that the letter E and the handwriting beneath it are his. Ehrlichman testified that he did not approve or have knowledge of the break-in in advance, and that his understanding of the term covert operation did not include a break-in. And in the edited presidential transcripts for a March 27, 1973 meeting, Ehrlichman, in reference to this break-in, is quoted as saying, "Well, sir, I didn't know what this crowd was up to until afterwards." However, the committee notes that the August 11th memorandum called for a covert operation to obtain medical files still held by Ellsberg's psychoanalyst. Other documentary evidence is also relevant. Thus, in a memorandum dated August 26, 1971, from Young to Ehrlichman, concerning a plan to disparage Ellsberg by feeding selected information to a congressional investigation, a footnote makes the following point. In connection with Issue 9, relating to changing Ellsberg's image, it is important to point out that with the recent article on Ellsberg's lawyer, Bowden, we have already started on a negative press image for Ellsberg. If the present Hunt-Liddy Project No. 1 is successful, it will be absolutely essential to have an overall game plan developed for its use in conjunction with the congressional investigation. In this connection, I believe that the point of Buchanan's memorandum on attacking Ellsberg through the press should be borne in mind, namely, that the situation being attacked is too big to be undermined by planting leaks among the friendly press. If there is to be any damaging of Ellsberg's image and those associated with him, it will therefore be necessary to fold in the press planting with the congressional investigation. I mentioned these points to Colson earlier this week, and his reply was that we should just leave it to him and he would take care of getting the information out. I believe, however, that in order to orchestrate this whole operation, we have to be aware of precisely what Colson wants to do. Recommendation: that you sign the memorandum to Colson asking him to draw up a game plan. Tab A. Tab A was a memorandum from Ehrlichman to Charles Colson dated August 27, 1971, which was only several days prior to the Ellsberg break-in, on the subject Hunt-Liddy Special Project No. 1. The memorandum from Ehrlichman to Colson stated, "On the assumption that the proposed undertaking by Hunt and Liddy would be carried out and would be successful, I would appreciate receiving from you by next Wednesday a game plan as to how and when you believe the materials should be used." The only Hunt-Liddy special project under consideration when these memorandums were written was the covert operation to obtain Ellsberg's medical records, and thus the only materials that would be received if the project were successful would be those medical records. It appears from these memorandums and Hunt's testimony before the committee that a primary strategy of the Plumbers was to obtain information to fuel a campaign to damage Ellsberg's image. This political motivation is highlighted in Young's August 26 memorandum to Ehrlichman by a bracketed note connecting Democratic Party leadership with the Ellsberg matter, which states, "I am sending you a separate Hunt to Colson memorandum, which attempts to select the politically damaging material involving the Democratic hierarchy. I personally believe a good deal more material could be developed along these lines. To begin with, we have Conan, Lansdale, Harkin, and Nolting, who could possibly be called to testify." There is also a July 28, 1971 memorandum from Hunt to Colson in which Hunt states, "I am proposing a skeletal operations plan aimed at building a file on Ellsberg that will contain all available overt, covert, and derogatory information. This basic tool is essential in determining how to destroy his public image and credibility." In his testimony before the committee, Hunt denies that the primary reason for the break-in was to destroy Ellsberg's public image, but he did admit that certain material expected to be obtained from Dr. Fielding's files might have been useful in discrediting Ellsberg. David Young has insisted to committee staff that the thrust of the entire psychiatric study of Ellsberg was to determine whether Ellsberg was the kind of person capable of manipulation or whether he was acting alone. In this regard, it should be noted that in the memorandum of August 26, referred to above, Young informed Ehrlichman, "It may well be that although Ehrlichman is guilty of the crimes with which he is charged, he did not in fact turn the papers over to the New York Times. The Defense Department's analysis of the printed material may even show that Ellsberg did not have some of the papers which the New York Times printed. Furthermore, the whole distribution network may be the work of still another and even larger network." Crow, in his statement after sentencing, disavowed any continuing belief that the Fielding operation was justified by national security. Judge Gerhard Gesell, the trial judge for the Ellsberg break-in case, also has rejected national security as a defense in that matter. Order of May 24, 1974. The edited transcripts of the presidential conversation submitted to the House Judiciary Committee suggest that the national security defense for the Ellsberg break-in may well have been an afterthought contrived to provide protection for those involved. The following exchange is at page 336. E. If Hunt talks, I would put the national security tent over the whole operation. P. I sure would. On June 3, 1974, Charles W. Colson pled guilty to a charge of obstructing justice by engaging in a scheme to prepare and obtain derogatory information about Daniel Ellsberg and to leak such information to certain newspapers for the purpose of publicly discrediting Ellsberg. Colson admitted he engaged in this conduct to prejudice Ellsberg in the criminal case against Ellsberg relating to the Pentagon Papers incident being prosecuted by the federal government. Colson had agreed with Hunt's recommendation that Ellsberg's psychiatric records be obtained, a recommendation that led to the burglary of Dr. Fielding's office by the Plumbers. Note: on July 12, 1974, after this report was prepared, Messrs. John Ehrlichman, Gordon Liddy, Bernard Barker, and Eugenio Martinez were convicted in federal court of conspiring to violate the civil rights of Dr. Fielding by illegally entering his office. Mr. Ehrlichman was also convicted on 2 counts of perjury to the grand jury investigating this matter. The evidence before the committee demonstrates that, in July and August 1971, the CIA provided technical assistance to Howard Hunt that, among other uses, was instrumental in the break-in of Dr. Fielding's office. This assistance was made available after then-Deputy Director General Robert E. Cushman received a request for aid from the White House and met with Hunt on July 22, 1971. According to Cushman, CIA assistance to Hunt was terminated when Hunt's demands became too extravagant that Cushman refused to meet them. Cushman testified before the committee that in July 1971 he received a call from Ehrlichman asking for assistance for Hunt. Cushman further testified that Ehrlichman stated that Howard Hunt was a bona fide employee, a consultant on security matters, and that Hunt would come to see me and request assistance which Mr. Ehrlichman requested that I give. Ehrlichman has denied any recollection of this call. He has also said that any call to the CIA is the kind of call that I usually have little or no difficulty in remembering. CIA records, however, indicate that it was Ehrlichman who made the July 1971 telephone call. The minutes of the meeting of the top CIA officials held several days after the telephone call show that Cushman reported that it was made by Ehrlichman. A transcript of the Cushman-Hunt meeting on July 22, 1971, indicates that Ehrlichman placed this call. Also, the CIA has provided the committee with a recently discovered transcript of the Ehrlichman to Cushman phone call prepared by Cushman's secretary. The transcript clearly shows that Ehrlichman made the call seeking assistance for Hunt and invoked the president's name in order to procure this aid. The transcript of this conversation reveals the following statement by Ehrlichman. Mr. Ehrlichman: I want to alert you that an old acquaintance, Howard Hunt, has been asked by the President to do some special consultant work on security problems. He may be contacting you sometime in the future for some assistance. I wanted you to know that he was in fact doing some things for the President. He is a longtime acquaintance with the people here. He may want some help on computer runs and other things. You should consider he has pretty much carte blanche. There is additional evidence regarding this telephone call that is instructive. On December 16, 1972, after the Department of Justice began its investigation of the Fielding matter, Cushman called Ehrlichman and stated that he was uncertain who called him in early July 1971 about Hunt. Ehrlichman told this to Dean, who requested that Ehrlichman ask Cushman to put this in writing. But Cushman, on January 8, 1973, sent a memorandum on the Hunt matter to Ehrlichman, stating that the early July telephone call was probably made by Ehrlichman, Colson, or Dean. Ehrlichman immediately called Cushman to complain about the inclusion of his name. Cushman, therefore, sent Ehrlichman another memorandum regarding Hunt, dated January 10, 1973, which stated that he could not recall who in the White House had called him. This memorandum was later given to Assistant U.S. Attorney Silbert. These two memorandums were written before Cushman refreshed his recollection by examining CIA documents prior to his testimony before the Select Committee. In late August 1971, after Hunt's demands became excessive, Cushman called Ehrlichman to complain. Ehrlichman said he then asked Cushman what Hunt's assignment was, and Cushman said he did not know. According to Ehrlichman, he, that is Ehrlichman, then said that he would take responsibility for terminating the CIA's assistance to Hunt, and if there were any squawks or kickbacks from anyone in the White House, to simply refer them to me. Shortly after this telephone call, CIA assistance to Hunt was terminated. 4. Project Sandwedge. The Committee to Re-elect the President was gearing up for its own political intelligence gathering program around the same time as the Ellsberg break-in. In September 1971, John Dean asked Jeb Stuart Magruder to join him for lunch with Jack Caulfield. Caulfield, a White House investigator who had conducted numerous political investigations, some with Anthony Ulasewicz, wanted to sell Magruder his political intelligence plan, Project Sandwedge, for use by CRP. Magruder had been organizing the campaign effort since May 1971, having received this assignment from Mitchell and Haldeman. In essence, the Sandwedge plan proposed a private corporation operating like a Republican Intertel to serve the president's campaign. In addition to normal investigative activities, the Sandwedge plan also included the use of bagmen and other covert intelligence gathering operations. Project Sandwich had been proposed to the White House by Caulfield in the spring of 1971, but was not favorably received by Mitchell and Ehrlichman. After the initial luncheon meeting between Magruder and Caulfield, the plan was again put to Mitchell, this time for use by CRP, but he again rejected it. 5. The hiring of G. Gordon Liddy by the Campaign Committee. With Sandwich rebuffed, Magruder and Gordon Stockman of Haldeman's staff asked Dean to find a lawyer to serve as CRP general counsel who could also direct an intelligence gathering program. Magruder stated that he and Dean had, on previous occasions, discussed the need for such a program with Attorney General Mitchell. The man Dean recruited was G. Gordon Liddy, who moved from the Special Investigations Unit in the White House to CRP. Magruder testified that, when Dean sent Liddy to the committee to re-elect the president in 1971, he, that is Magruder, was unaware of Liddy's activities for the Plumbers, particularly his participation in the break-in of Dr. Fielding's office. Dean had first asked Crow whether David Young would be available for the special CRP assignment. Crow said no, but suggested Liddy, with the caveat that Ehrlichman must approve of the transfer. Subsequently, Crow informed Dean that Ehrlichman did approve. Dean then called Mitchell to tell him that Crow, with Ehrlichman's sanction, had recommended Liddy and to arrange for Mitchell to meet Liddy. Ehrlichman, however, denied in a committee staff interview that he approved Liddy's assignment to the CRP and has stated that he first learned of Liddy's CRP employment after the Watergate break-in. The record shows that Mitchell, still the Attorney General, interviewed Liddy on November 24, 1971, and approved Liddy for his position with CRP. B. The Committee for the Re-election of the President and its relation to the White House. Before relating the evidence regarding the planning of the CRP's political intelligence gathering program that ultimately resulted in the Watergate break-in, it is important briefly to identify CRP's close relation with, if not domination by, the White House. The evidence accumulated by the Select Committee demonstrates that CRP was a White House product answerable to top White House leadership. It appears that H.R. Haldeman, the President's Chief of Staff, was principally responsible for organizing CRP. John Mitchell has stated that Haldeman was the moving force. In May 1971, Jeb Magruder, then a Haldeman staff assistant, was released from his White House position and assigned the task of building the re-election committee. With Magruder on this assignment were Harry S. Fleming, Hugh W. Sloan, Jr., Herbert Porter, Robert Odle, and Dr. Robert Merrick. All but Merrick were former White House aides. Magruder cleared all recruitment of White House personnel for the committee with Haldeman. Although Attorney General Mitchell also passed on the appointment of persons to important re-election committee positions, Richard Kleindienst, in a meeting with the President on April 15, 1973, characterized Mitchell's role in the formulation of CRP as that of a puppet. The evidence, however, shows that Mitchell assumed a political managerial role as to the election effort as early as the spring of 1971, a year before he left his position as Attorney General. It was understood, even at that early time, that Mitchell would take full charge of the campaign when it went into high gear. Thus, Mitchell received memorandums for his information and approval from CRP as early as May 1971. The campaign organization eventually evolved into two entities. 1. The Committee for the Re-election of the President, which had the responsibility for political activity. 2. The Finance Committee for the Re-election of the President, the organ responsible for campaign fundraising and disbursement. Approximately 35 White House aides left their positions to assume key or low-level positions at CRP or FCRP. A comparison of the CRP organization chart and the White House organization chart for the period of 1971 to 72 shows that most important positions in the campaign organizations were held by former White House aides. Magruder was the caretaker director of the campaign political arm from May 1971 until March 1972, when Mitchell took over the duties of campaign director. To keep Haldeman informed daily of CRP operations, Gordon Stockman, a Haldeman staff assistant, was designated as the liaison between Haldeman and Magruder. On a regular basis, Magruder provided Stockman with reports of CRP activities and decision memorandums requiring Haldeman's approval. Robert Odle, CRP administrative assistant under Magruder, testified that CRP memorandums went to the White House in such significant numbers that there was a sample memorandum in the staff manual showing the prescribed form for a memorandum from a CRP staffer to Haldeman or other White House personnel. Magruder also sent a flow of memorandums to Mitchell for his reaction or approval. Examples of memorandums to Mitchell while he was still Attorney General are exhibits number 74 and 75. As noted, Mitchell's campaign activity began as early as May 1971. Prior to his appearance before the Select Committee, Mitchell testified in March 1972 before the Senate Judiciary Committee that he had no re-election campaign responsibilities before his resignation as Attorney General. The two divisions of the campaign organization were ultimately headed by two cabinet members. Mitchell became director of CRP, and Secretary of Commerce Maurice Stans retired to head FCRP. Mr. Stans testified before the committee that, as FCRP director, he raised approximately $60 million for the campaign. These funds were dispersed on the basis of decisions made by a budget committee consisting of key officials of CRP and FCRP. These decisions were at times reviewed by Haldeman. After the November election, FCRP had a substantial surplus, much of which was apparently used to defend itself in lawsuits and to pay legal fees of former CRP and FCRP officials involved in various Watergate-related legal matters. As the Select Committee files its final report, approximately $3.5 million in FCRP surplus is still held by the Campaign Liquidation Trust. On the basis of this evidence, the committee finds that the Committee for the Re-election of the President and the Finance Committee to re-elect the President were, in the main, White House staffed and White House-controlled political organizations. It finds that they were initially conceived and created for the purpose of assuring White House control over the campaign funds raised by FCRP and the campaign strategies planned and implemented by CRP. End of section 2.